Welcome to the channel. We are grateful to have you joining this peaceful space. Before we begin, I invite you to subscribe, activate the bell icon, and leave a gentle comment with your thoughts or requests for future stories. Now, settle in, relax your shoulders, and let the soothing rhythm of this journey carry you toward a peaceful night's sleep. In a distant era when glaciers retreated and the air warmed, a pair of great rivers cut through the land. These waters would later be called the Tigris and the Euphrates. They flowed quietly from high mountains down to wide plains. Between them lay fertile ground, softened by silt. The world around them was peaceful and empty. There were no cities, no kings, only small bands of people who moved with the seasons. For many generations, these people lived as nomads. They tracked herds of game across the hills and gathered berries and nuts. Their lives followed the rhythms of migration. Nothing held them in one place. Then a small change began. As the ice melted, wild grasses took root near riverbanks. The seeds of wheat and barley grew plump and plentiful. Hunters noticed that food could be found without endless wandering. They started to stay longer in one spot to harvest these grains. Clumps of simple shelters appeared near the rivers. They were round huts woven from reeds and plastered with mud. Families shared laughter around small fires. The people still hunted gazelle and collected fruits, but they also picked heads of grain. They found that if they scattered seeds in bare soil, more plants sprouted. It seemed as if they could call forth food from the earth. Though they did not yet know it, their way of life was changing. On the banks of the Jordan Valley, one village grew larger than any other. We call this place Jericho. Its inhabitants built a stone wall to protect themselves and their stored grain. They erected a mysterious tower that rose above their huts, its purpose still unknown. At this time, across the highlands of Anatolia, another settlement emerged. This was Çatalhöyük. Houses stood cheek by jowl, with flat roofs connecting them. People entered their homes through openings above, moving quietly across rooftops like cats. The greatest change happened in fields and enclosures. Over many seasons, these people saved seeds from the strongest plants. They planted them in neat rows and waited. The grains they grew became larger than those they found in the wild. Wolves that lingered near human campfires were tolerated and then befriended. Their pups remained and became dogs. Wild cattle, goats, and sheep were lured by food and water and slowly came under human control. Domestication unfolded slowly, unnoticed by those within it. With crops and herds came surplus food. Families gathered more wheat than they could eat before the next harvest. They did not need to pack up when the seasons changed. They could build heavier houses with thicker walls. People began to swap baskets of grain for crafted objects. Some began to specialize. One person shaped clay into pots, another carved stone beads. Exchange allowed creativity to thrive. The new abundance also brought new challenges. Stored grain attracted both neighbors and thieves. The people constructed fences and walls. They assigned watchers to guard food stores. Someone needed to decide where irrigation ditches should be dug and when fields should be watered. The need for cooperation pulled these families together. Small decisions created the foundation of social organization. As villages spread across the valley, their people looked to the sky and wondered about the forces that controlled rain and flood. They carved small figurines and placed them on simple altars. They whispered prayers to unknown powers, hoping for fertile fields and gentle seasons. Rituals emerged that linked the community together. Singing and shared meals soothed fears about storms and droughts. A sense of sacred order began to shape daily life. The rivers themselves taught lessons. Each spring they swelled with snowmelt and overflowed their banks. The floodwaters left behind dark, rich soil. Planting after the flood gave the best yields. People learned to dig channels that guided the water into their fields when rains were scarce. Over time, networks of canals spread across the plain. The rivers became partners in human survival. In this era, tools also changed. At first, farmers harvested grain with sharp stones tied to handles. Later, they noticed that mixing soft copper with tin created a stronger metal. Bronze sickles cut stalks cleanly. With sturdier tools, larger fields could be managed. Pottery, once crude, was turned on a wheel to make smooth jars. These advances came slowly, yet each improved life. In the quiet evenings, elders told stories by firelight. They spoke of the old days when their ancestors roamed freely and of the new world of settled fields. They wondered if wild spirits would be angered by fences. Children listened and drifted off to sleep. Dreams wove together memories of forests and visions of burgeoning villages. The pace of change was gentle but relentless. As more families joined together, the fabric of community thickened. Disputes arose over who could dig canals or harvest certain groves. Informal gatherings turned into councils. The oldest or wisest were asked to mediate. These early decisions, though modest, set patterns for leadership. Influence flowed from the ability to organize and to appease unseen powers. Days turned into years, and years into generations. The people by the rivers barely noticed how their lives had transformed. What had once been temporary camps became permanent settlements. Children grew up not knowing the nomadic life of their grandparents. The sound of millstones grinding grain and the barking of penned goats replaced the silence of open plains. Settled life had taken root. The rivers continued to run, glinting under the sun and shimmering under the stars. Human hands had begun to shape their flow, but the waters still followed their course to the distant sea. Along their banks, human communities learned to trust in seasons, to plant and harvest, to work and rest. The first steps toward civilization were quiet and gradual, like the gentle current of a stream. Much later, people would look back on this period and imagine dramatic turning points. In truth, the changes unfolded almost imperceptibly. A family chose to build a second grain bin. a neighboring village decided to align houses along a shared path. A group agreed to celebrate the harvest on the same day. These small choices created a web of shared habits. The rhythm of daily life slowed from wandering to waiting. Stillness brought both security and new fears. Early dwellings were decorated with painted images. Hands dipped in red ochre left outlines on plastered walls. Stylized animals and simple patterns adorned household spaces. Some houses contained shrines with sculpted bulls' heads or feminine figurines. These images may have represented requests for fertility or protection. Art gave shape to intangible hopes and fears and brightened the muted tones of mud and reed. Water was both a blessing and a threat. Rains could be unpredictable. A downpour could wash away newly planted seeds, while months of drought could wither crops before harvest. People watched clouds and winds, seeking signs of what the skies might bring. They began to store water in clay jars and reservoirs. Sharing water fairly required agreements. Breaking these agreements stirred anger. Thus, the first laws took shape around rights to water and grain. As communities grew, so did the need for organized labor. Digging canals required many hands. Harvesting vast fields of wheat demanded coordination. In response, some individuals took on the role of directing others, not by force at first, but through persuasion and trust. People followed those who seemed to have the favor of the gods or who spoke well at gatherings. This gradual emergence of leadership would lay the groundwork for future governance. Wild animals were both companions and competitors. Dogs guarded flocks, but wolves prowled at the edges. Birds descended on crops, forcing farmers to devise scarecrows and nets. Fish filled the rivers, offering another source of food, but crocodiles and snakes lurked in the marshes. Learning to coexist with and manage these creatures became part of everyday life. Observing animal behavior deepened human understanding of the environment. One of the earliest traded goods was obsidian. This glassy volcanic stone, razor sharp when fractured, was not found near the rivers. It came from distant mountains. Traders carried it in small parcels across long distances. In exchange, they took grain, textiles, or worked beads. This exchange created connections between communities separated by days of travel. Over time, trade would weave a network linking the entire region. Even in these early times, people marked moments with song and dance. They clapped hands, stamped feet, and hummed melodies to celebrate births, mourn deaths, and mark the turning of seasons. Simple drums and flutes carved from bone provided rhythm. Music eased the monotony of labor and strengthened bonds among neighbors. It carried stories from one generation to the next when words alone might fail. As generation followed generation, the landscape itself began to change under human influence. Forests near settlements were cleared to make way for fields. Mud walls reshaped floodplains. Ponds dug for irrigation attracted new birds and fish. The wild world receded just a little. The cultivated world expanded just a little. This process would accelerate in later ages, but its roots lay in these first villages. Light at night came from small oil lamps fashioned from clay. The lamps burned animal fat or pressed seeds. Their flickering light cast dancing shadows on walls. Families gathered around these lamps to mend nets, weave baskets, or simply sit quietly. Darkness still held mysteries. The stars above seemed eternal and unchanging. People gave them names and wove tales about their patterns. Though grounded in mud huts, their minds traveled far beyond. Fire was a constant companion. It cooked food, hardened clay, and warded off predators. It also posed a danger. A stray ember could ignite a thatched roof. People learned to manage flames carefully, storing live coals in pots and covering hearths with stones. Over time, these practices became rituals with offerings made before lighting communal fires. The control of fire was both practical and symbolic. The sounds of this world were humble and soothing. The murmur of water flowing in ditches, the soft bleating of sheep, the rustle of reeds in the wind. Human voices rose and fell in conversation and song. There were no engines, no loud machines. Life unfolded at a pace set by seasons and daylight. Such a rhythm gave space for reflection, for dreaming, for connection. To keep track of passing days, people looked to the sky. They noticed the moon's phases waxing and waning and counted nights from one new crescent to the next. They observed when certain stars rose before dawn at different times of the year. In damp clay, they pressed marks or arranged small stones to record days until harvest or the return of migrating birds. These early calendars were simple, yet they gave shape to time itself. Burials revealed tender care for the deceased. Bodies were interred beneath house floors, wrapped in woven mats and accompanied by small gifts. A bead necklace, a bowl of grain, or a polished stone. Loved ones visited these spots, perhaps whispering messages to those gone. Ancestors thus remained within the living community, their presence felt beneath each step. Memory joined earth and stone. Illnesses were treated with herbs and touch. Wise women learned which plants eased fever, soothed coughs, or helped wounds to close. Midwives attended births and sang to ease labor pains. If sickness lingered, people might place offerings at a household shrine or sing songs to spirits of healing. Care was both practical and spiritual. Recovery depended on both careful hands and the favor of unseen forces. Clothing was crafted from woven fibers and cured skins. Reed mats were stripped into threads and twisted into cords, then woven on simple looms to make tunics and cloaks. Animal hides were scraped clean, softened with oil, and stitched together with bone needles. Beads made from shells or seeds decorated hems. Garments offered warmth, protection, and beauty, linking the wearer to both field and river. Each stitch held a quiet memory and hope. After learning to harvest wild grains and domesticate animals, the people of the fertile plains began to adapt their lives around these discoveries. The change from foraging to farming did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process of observing which seeds grew best and which animals stayed close to campfires. Over many seasons, they noticed that planting in orderly rows produced more abundant harvests than scattering seed by chance. Fields expanded beyond the immediate edges of villages. Families measured the seasons by the height of the river and the length of shadows. They dug furrows with sharpened sticks and later used wooden plows to turn the soil. Working oxen pulled these plows, their hooves sinking into the rich mud. The steady rhythm of plowing marked the beginning of agricultural routine. As crops multiplied, so did the need to store them. People built granaries from packed earth and woven reed baskets lined with clay. Raised platforms kept grain dry and safe from pests. The collective labor invested in these structures fostered a sense of shared responsibility. Watching over full granaries through the seasons became a communal task.
Animals took on new roles in this changing world. Cattle were no longer merely sources of meat, but became living tools. They pulled plows and turned wheels that ground grain. Sheep and goats provided milk, wool, and skins. Pigs thrived on scraps near human settlements. The bond between humans and their herds deepened. Herding required constant attention, leading some individuals to become specialists.
Irrigation emerged as a vital innovation. The rivers flooded unpredictably, bringing both life and destruction. By digging channels and ditches, people could guide water to their fields and gardens. The first canals were simple trenches that diverted flow from nearby streams. Over time, networks of waterways grew longer and more complex. Managing them required coordination among many families. The organization needed for irrigation influenced social structures. Meetings were called to decide when to open or close gates. Disputes over water rights were settled by elders who had long observed the river's behavior. Cooperation became essential. Those who could mobilize workers and resolve conflicts gained respect. The concept of leadership took root in the ability to orchestrate communal labor. Food production created new types of work. Some villagers experimented with mixing clays and baking them in fire pits to create sturdier vessels. Early pottery was thick and uneven, but over time, hands grew steadier and designs more graceful. Potter's wheels spun slowly at first, shaped by human power. These innovations allowed people to store liquids and grains more efficiently and to transport them over longer distances. Textile production also evolved. Women and men twisted fibers from flax and wool into thread and wove them into cloth on simple looms. Fabrics replaced animal skins for many garments, offering lightness and comfort in the heat. Weaving required patience and skill. Patterns were simple at first, but gradually stripes and checks added beauty to function. Surplus goods encouraged exchange beyond neighboring settlements. Traders ventured farther along the riverbanks, carrying baskets of grain, wool, and pottery. In return, they brought obsidian, shells, and pigments not found locally. These journeys fostered connections between distant communities. Such travel also spread ideas. New ways to plant, new songs, new stories. The rhythm of agricultural life created its own calendar. Festivals celebrated planting, weeding, and harvest. Each event was marked by music, feasting, and communal work. At the start of the growing season, villagers gathered to prepare the fields together. Children scattered seeds as elders chanted. At harvest, everyone joined to reap and thresh. These shared tasks strengthened bonds and established traditions. Emerging crafts demanded more specialized knowledge. Some individuals studied the behavior of animals to improve breeding. Others learned to recognize signs of disease in crops and to prescribe remedies like ash or salt. Knowledge was passed down through apprenticeship. Young people listened to the guidance of older farmers and artisans, learning by doing rather than by formal instruction. Agricultural tools improved incrementally. Stone sickles were replaced by bronze blades, which stayed sharp longer and cut more evenly. The introduction of the hoe made weeding easier. Simple sledges and carts eased the transport of harvests. Each advancement saved time and energy, allowing farmers to manage larger fields or to pursue secondary crafts during slower seasons. Permanent houses grew in size and complexity. Walls were thickened with multiple layers of mud plaster. Roofs were supported by timber beams. Floors were smoothed with polished clay. Rooms were divided to separate storage from living space. Some dwellings included small courtyards where herbs were grown. Neighbors built adjoining walls, creating continuous blocks of housing. Domestic life adapted to agricultural rhythms. Morning tasks included tending to animals and checking irrigation channels. Midday brought a rest in the shade. Evening was for grinding grain and cooking. The smells of baking bread and boiling stews filled the air. Conversations around the hearth revolved around weather, crop conditions, and the well-being of livestock. The need to protect stored food led to the construction of walls around entire communities. These walls were not yet the imposing fortifications of later cities, but they provided a sense of security. Watchpoints allowed guards to see across fields. The walls also marked a boundary between cultivated space and the wild beyond. Crossing this boundary became a daily ritual for farmers and herders. The expansion of farming required clearing more land. Forests were cut back and marshes were drained. Burning brush created fertile ash, but it also altered the habitats of wild animals. Some species moved away, while others adapted to living at the edges of fields. Human impact on the environment intensified, though still small compared to later times. Villages competed and cooperated. Sometimes disputes over pastures or water led to skirmishes. At other times, neighboring settlements joined forces to construct larger canals or to fend off bands of raiders. These interactions laid the groundwork for alliances and rivalries that would shape political landscapes in ages to come. The rise of agriculture affected spiritual beliefs. People honored deities associated with earth and fertility. Rituals were performed to ensure rains came at the right time, and that floods did not destroy crops. Temples, still simple in form, were built near fields. Offerings of grain, fruit, and animal milk were placed on altars. Priests or priestesses interpreted signs and dreams, claiming to discern the will of invisible powers. Seasonal cycles influenced storytelling. Mythologies emerged that explained the birth of grain and the ebb and flow of rivers. Tales of heroic farmers who tamed wild bulls or discovered seeds were told alongside older stories of hunters. These narratives were shared at night under the stars or during communal meals. Through them, knowledge and values were transmitted in memorable forms. Health practices adapted to sedentary life. Constant work in damp fields led to ailments. Healers used herbs to treat swollen joints and to cleanse wounds. They recommended rest when fever struck. Certain plants were known to repel insects that threatened both humans and crops. The relationship between physical well-being and successful harvests became clear. A healthy community produced more food. Agriculture also shaped the growth of families. Children were seen as helpers in the fields and heirs to farmland. More children meant more hands to plant and harvest. Extended families lived together in larger compounds. Elders cared for the youngest while parents worked. This intergenerational cooperation strengthened kinship bonds and ensured continuity of knowledge. The responsibility of measuring land arose with farming. Boundary markers were set to divide plots. Sometimes these markers were stones or wooden stakes. Other times, they were trees left standing. Arguments over the exact placement of boundaries were settled by communal decision or by reference to memory. Clear boundaries reduced conflict and increased efficiency. Over years, storage techniques improved. Clay jars were sealed with straw and mud to keep contents dry. Cellars were dug below houses to keep produce cool. Smokehouses dried meat for winter. These innovations allowed food to be preserved for lean times. They also enabled families to accumulate wealth in the form of stored surplus. As villages grew, so did trade in services. Skilled builders were hired to construct granaries or walls. Potters made vessels on order. Weavers accepted wool as payment for cloth. A simple system of exchange based on barter-linked producers and consumers. Trust was essential, and reputation mattered. Word of a reliable craftsman or a dishonest trader spread quickly along the river. The idea of ownership began to form around fields and animals. What had once been considered communal grazing land became divided into family plots. People felt a sense of attachment to specific pieces of earth. This attachment created both pride and jealousy. Regulations emerged to define inheritance and to prevent disputes from tearing communities apart. Record keeping started in rudimentary ways. Marks were scratched on clay tablets to note the number of baskets stored or the distribution of seed grain. These early notations were simple, but they signaled an awareness of the need to remember quantities accurately. Counting moved from the hand to the tablet, from the mind to a material record. As tasks became more specialized, some members of the community gained time to observe the heavens. They tracked the paths of stars and the cycles of the moon to refine planting dates. Lunar calendars were compared with river levels. Predictions about floods grew more precise. The connection between celestial patterns and earthly prosperity deepened. Agricultural life also shaped relationships with neighboring wild landscapes. Hunters still ventured into forests to supplement diets with meat. Gatherers still collected herbs, honey, and nuts. These excursions maintained knowledge of wilderness. Yet each year, the distance to unworked land increased. The contrast between cultivated order and wild abundance became more pronounced. Despite the stability agriculture brought, life remained fragile. Drought could shrivel crops, floods could drown seedlings, pests could decimate harvests. Communities learned to diversify, planting different crops, keeping varied animals, and maintaining networks of mutual aid. Resilience became part of their culture. Stories celebrated endurance and ingenuity in the face of hardship. Agricultural work required patience. Seeds were planted with no guarantee of return. Farmers watched over fields for months, weeding and watering. They learned to accept that not every seed would sprout and not every plant would survive. This acceptance of uncertainty tempered the desire for immediate reward. Waiting became a virtue. With surplus food and organized labor, thoughts turned toward building something more lasting. Some elders dreamed of a place where people could gather not just to work, but to celebrate and to worship. The earliest communal buildings were simple assembly halls made from wood and clay. They provided shelter from sun and rain and served as venues for dispute resolution and ceremony. The momentum of agricultural innovation continued slowly but steadily. New crops were introduced, legumes that enriched the soil and fruit trees that offered sweet nourishment. Farmers experimented with crop rotation, leaving fields fallow to restore fertility. Wisdom accrued like layers of sediment. Each generation added a small insight, a new technique, a better tool. Over time, the constant irrigation began to affect the soil itself. Salt accumulated in furrows as water evaporated under the sun. Yields declined in the most heavily watered fields. Farmers responded by allowing plots to rest and by flushing salts away during floods. They mixed earth with ashes and spread manure to renew fertility. Awareness of soil health grew alongside awareness of plant growth. The abundance of food and shorter workdays created space for leisure. In the shade of trees, adults carved small figurines from bone and stone. Children played games with pebbles and sticks. Stories were told not only to teach, but to entertain. Decorative arts flourished, with beads sewn onto clothing and vessels painted with simple motifs. These pastimes reminded the community that life was not only toil, but also beauty and joy. Shared laughter and simple games nourished their spirits as much as food did on quiet evenings. As agriculture flourished and surplus grew, some settlements began to transform. What had once been clusters of huts expanded as more families settled near reliable water and fertile fields. Houses multiplied, lanes formed, and open spaces became markets. The density of life brought both opportunity and challenge. People lived closer together, sharing walls and wells. This closeness demanded new forms of cooperation and new rules for daily conduct. In these growing settlements, different neighborhoods developed their own character. One area might be known for potters, with wheel sounds filling the air and rows of drying vessels catching the sun. Another might house metal workers, whose fires glowed at dusk as copper and tin were melted and poured. Near the center, a communal space served as a gathering place for meetings and festivals. The first hints of urban structure were taking shape. Public buildings began to rise, modest at first, but distinct from ordinary homes. These structures might contain a raised platform where offerings were placed and rituals performed. Over time, these shrines expanded into larger temples. Walls became thicker, courtyards were added, and doorways faced east to greet the dawn. The community invested time and resources into these sacred spaces, believing that favor from unseen forces could be secured through proper attention. As people spent more time in one place, possessions accumulated. Some families stored more grain and livestock than others. Differences in wealth appeared. Those with larger storage rooms or more land began to influence decisions about water allocation and communal projects. This gradual concentration of resources led to social stratification. Respect and authority were no longer solely based on age or experience, but also on ownership and the ability to command labor. Specialization intensified. Some individuals no longer worked in fields at all. They devoted themselves entirely to crafting tools, weaving fine fabrics, or shaping ornate pottery. Others became full-time builders, learning to construct with fired bricks and to erect arches for doorways. This specialization allowed skills to improve rapidly. Beautiful objects emerged, not merely useful, but designed to delight the eye. Trade routes extended further. Caravans of donkeys carried textiles and ceramics across desert paths to distant valleys. Boats traveled along the rivers laden with jars of oil and baskets of barley. Exchanges were recorded in memory or with tokens that represented quantities of goods. As the volume of trade increased, memorizing all transactions became impossible. A new need arose, a reliable method to remember agreements and inventories. At first, people used small clay tokens, shaped like cones, spheres, or discs, to symbolize amounts of grain, jars of oil, or livestock. These tokens were stored in clay envelopes. Over time, people pressed the token shapes onto the outside and realized that the impression alone could serve as a record. This insight sparked a revolution. Instead of making three-dimensional tokens, people pressed marks directly onto flat clay tablets. Each mark represented a specific item or quantity. At first, these marks were simple pictographs, images of a jar, a sheep, or a grain stalk. A group of marks conveyed that 7 jars of oil had been delivered, or 20 sheep had been received. The earliest writing had a purely practical purpose: to keep accounts. Over time, the marks evolved to record not only objects, but also abstract ideas such as ownership or place. Additional signs were developed. Sounds came to be represented through combinations of marks. The pictograph for a mouth might come to represent the sound ka, regardless of whether a mouth was involved in the transaction. Gradually, writing shifted from pictorial representation to a system capable of recording spoken language. As this system spread, scribes trained for years. They shaped clay tablets and pressed marks with a reed, carefully correcting mistakes. This training created a new class. Students from affluent families learned writing, numbers, and lists. Repetition ingrained hundreds of signs. Literacy remained rare, but vital for managing resources. Scribes held esteemed positions. They served temples, merchants, and rulers alike. Their ability to make spoken words permanent granted them influence beyond their number. The uses of writing quickly expanded beyond accounting. Administrative lists recorded the workers assigned to canal digging or the distribution of rations to laborers. Temple inventories listed offerings received and animals sacrificed. Rulers had their accomplishments inscribed on bricks or pillars. Writing began to confer permanence to words that would otherwise be lost to time. Decisions could be reviewed, promises upheld, and laws communicated across generations.
Within temples, collections of tablets grew. Shelves held tablets organized by purpose. Some contained hymns and prayers to be recited. Others recorded myths and stories of the gods. These early libraries preserved cultural memory. Priests and scribes could pull a tablet and perform a ritual exactly as prescribed, ensuring continuity. Writing thus reinforced the role of temples as centers of knowledge and authority.
As cities emerged, architecture reflected social hierarchy. Near the temple complex, large houses with multiple rooms and courtyards were built for families of status. Their walls were decorated with colored plaster and their floors covered with woven mats. Servants moved quietly through back passages. Further away, simpler one-room homes housed craftspeople and laborers. Narrow lanes separated these dwellings, and shared courtyards served multiple families. Markets became more organized. Stalls lined specific streets, each dedicated to a particular trade. Basket makers in one row, fish sellers in another. Weights and measures were standardized to facilitate fair exchange. Officials ensured that scales were balanced and that merchants did not cheat. Disputes were settled at designated places by appointed elders or priests who consulted written agreements when necessary. The growth of urban centers also demanded greater planning. Canals had to supply water to ever larger populations. Waste needed to be removed. Paths had to be maintained to allow carts and animals to move goods. Individuals or committees oversaw these tasks. Some labor was voluntary, but much was organized through systems of corvée. Citizens contributed a portion of their time to public works. In return, they received rations or reduction in obligations. Differences in status became more pronounced. Families involved in temple administration or trade accumulated goods and influence. they could afford luxury items like carved stone bowls, jewelry made from rare materials, and elaborate garments. They ate from finer vessels and consumed richer foods. Their tombs contained objects intended to accompany them into the afterlife. Meanwhile, common laborers lived modestly, with fewer possessions and little say in governance. Religious practices evolved to match the complexity of city life. Temples expanded, featuring multiple rooms for different rituals and for storing offerings. Priests specialized. Some tended to the statue of the deity, others handled offerings, and still others interpreted omens. Festivals became grander, drawing people from surrounding villages. Processions carried statues through the streets, accompanied by music and incense. Writing played a role in codifying religious myths. Stories of creation, divine quarrels, and human origins were written on clay, transforming fluid oral tales into fixed texts. Hymns to deities were composed and recorded, ensuring that rituals were performed consistently. The act of writing itself was considered sacred. Scribes sometimes prayed to a goddess of writing before beginning their work, asking for steady hands and clear minds. Law emerged from a combination of custom, communal decision, and written codification. Early disputes were resolved by elders drawing on memory and oral precedent. But as communities grew, it became harder to remember every case. Written lists of laws were created to define penalties for theft, assault, or failure to fulfill obligations. These laws were often inscribed on durable materials and placed in public areas. Everyone could see them, though only scribes could read them, ensuring that judgment was not arbitrary. Artistic expression flourished. Pottery continued to improve, with thinner walls and more complex shapes. Designs painted on jars depicted scenes of everyday life: herders with flocks, boats on rivers, and people engaged in music. Seals carved from stone were used to stamp images onto clay, serving both as signatures and as decorative elements. Jewelry became more intricate, incorporating beads of lapis lazuli, carnelian, and gold. Music filled the urban air. Harps, drums, and flutes provided rhythm for processions and ceremonies. Songs that had accompanied farming tasks now accompanied rituals within temple walls. Dancers moved in circles, hands linked, their steps echoing ancient rhythms. Movement and sound merged to honor the gods and to entertain. The sounds of the city were no longer just the clatter of tools and the murmur of markets, but also the melodies of new arts. Education broadened beyond scribes. Craftspeople taught apprentices. Parents instructed children in basic arithmetic and measurement necessary for trade. Storytellers memorized and recited longer narratives, passing them down intact. Knowledge became compartmentalized, each profession guarding its secrets while also contributing to the collective advancement of the city. Connections to rural areas remained crucial. Cities did not feed themselves. Farmers continued to grow grain, raise animals, and cultivate orchards. They delivered produce to urban markets, receiving tools, textiles, and pottery in return. The boundary between city and countryside became more defined but remained porous. Festivals drew villagers into cities, while city dwellers visited relatives and ancestral fields. As administrative records accumulated, archives expanded. The weight of clay tablets increased, necessitating the construction of storage rooms. Cataloging systems emerged. Tablets were grouped by topic or by year. Librarians, a new profession, were charged with maintaining order. They could locate a contract or a hymn when requested by a priest or official. The psychological impact of writing was profound. Memory once held collectively in stories and songs could now be externalized. People could consult a tablet rather than rely solely on elders' recollections. This shift altered the authority of spoken word. What was written could be considered more permanent, more true. Oral tradition continued, but it now coexisted with written records that anchored decisions and beliefs. Diplomatic communication also benefited from writing. Leaders could send letters on clay tablets sealed with cylindrical seals. These tablets bore seal impressions identifying senders. Messengers followed river paths and overland routes, creating a network of communication that connected cities. Diplomacy completely depended on trust in these carriers and their seals. Upon arrival, the recipient broke the seal and read the message. Written correspondence thus extended the reach of urban diplomacy. The emergence of cities required the management of diverse peoples. Within urban walls lived those of different origins, dialects, and skills. Negotiating these differences required tolerance and law. Markets needed rules to protect buyers and sellers. Temples needed guidelines for offerings and festivals. Writing allowed these rules to be articulated and preserved. As writing became more versatile, literature blossomed. Teachers compiled proverbs and sayings that distilled practical wisdom. Poets composed epics, recounting heroic deeds and the favor or wrath of gods. These works were copied and studied in scribal schools. Through literature, abstract ideas like virtue, justice, and fate entered the realm of written thought. While writing expanded possibilities, it also had limits. Clay tablets were heavy and fragile. Rain could melt away inscriptions. Fires could reduce archives to shards. To protect records, scribes sometimes fired tablets in kilns, making them more durable. Others stored copies in multiple locations. The fragility of written records contrasted with the durability of stone monuments and oral tradition. In time, the earliest cities became models for others. New settlements sought to emulate their organization. Central temples, administrative quarters, artisans' districts, and marketplaces. Knowledge of how to build a city spread through trade and migration. The idea of urbanism took hold as part of what it meant to be civilized. The dawn of writing and the rise of cities did not erase old ways completely. Farmers still watched the sky and remembered tales of ancestors. Villagers still sang songs while working, but something fundamental had shifted. Words pressed into clay endured beyond a single voice. Decisions made in council could be revisited by future generations. stories could travel farther than any person. The urban and literate world was taking shape, quietly yet inexorably slowly. The southern sweep where the twin rivers approached the sea softened into a plain of silt and marshes. Here, amidst reeds and date palms, people gathered to build something entirely new. Their huts turned into clusters of houses, and these clusters grew into true cities. Names like Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Kish he whispered across the flatlands. Each settlement rose from mud brick and straw, enclosed by walls that protected from flooding and raiders. At dawn, sunlight glowed on the flat roofs. At dusk, the air filled with the smell of baking bread and the murmur of neighbors greeting each other. A new way of living had emerged, urban life. At the heart of each city stood a temple. These were not simple huts, but tall platforms topped with shrines. Their massive foundations were built from millions of bricks baked in kilns. Stairways climbed the platforms, leading worshippers toward the sacred chamber. Priests tended fires and offered food to the gods, believing the deities resided within the statues. The largest temple in Uruk, later called the White Temple, gleamed with whitewashed walls. Such buildings provided a focal point for the community, both spiritually and practically. Temples stored grain, organized labor, and distributed food during lean times. They were the first institutions that held the city together. The cities depended on complex social organization. At the top were priests who interpreted the will of the gods and controlled the temples. Below them were rulers, often called lugals or big men, who commanded armies and coordinated large projects. Their authority rested on their ability to protect the city and to ensure the gods were satisfied. Scribes formed another vital group. They learned the intricate system of wedge-shaped signs pressed into clay. With styluses of reed, they recorded deliveries of grain, transfers of land, and decrees from kings. Craftsmen and traders flourished, making pottery, weaving textiles, and exchanging goods with distant lands. Farmers and laborers formed the base of society, working the fields and digging canals. At the lowest level were slaves, sometimes prisoners of war, who performed heavy labor. Together, these groups maintained the delicate balance of urban life. Architecture reflected this social complexity. Houses varied in size and decoration. Some families lived in small, one-room homes with simple furnishings. Others occupied sprawling compounds with multiple courtyards, storage rooms, and private chapels. Streets were narrow and winding. Sewage ran in channels between houses. City walls encircled neighborhoods, providing protection, but also creating a sense of separation from the open plain. Within the walls, everyday life unfolded in a rhythm of work and rest. Women ground grain, brewed beer, and cared for children. Men tended to fields, crafted tools, or joined defense patrols. Evenings were spent in conversation under the glow of oil lamps. The sights and sounds of city life differed greatly from the older villages. Religion permeated every aspect of life. The people believed that each city had its patron deity who watched over them. In Uruk, the goddess Inanna, embodiment of love and war, presided. In Eridu, the god Enki ruled water and wisdom. Nippur honored Enlil, lord of wind and storms. Offerings were made daily. Festivals marked the seasons, with processions of priests carrying statues of gods through the streets. Music, song, and dance accompanied these celebrations. Myths explained the relationship between humans and gods. Stories of creation told how the gods fashioned humans from clay to serve them. Tales recounted how the gods sent floods to cleanse the world, leaving a few survivors to restart humanity. These narratives gave meaning to life's cycles and justified the authority of temples and their priests. Ziggurats, or stepped towers, began to appear. Early versions were platforms with 1 or 2 levels, but over time they grew taller and more elaborate. The ziggurat of Ur, built centuries later, rose like a mountain from the flat plain. Each level receded, creating a staircase of terraces leading to a small shrine at the summit. These structures symbolized a bridge between earth and heaven. They required enormous quantities of brick and labor. Their construction was a testament to the organizational ability of the city. Workers hauled clay, mixed straw, and baked bricks. Overseers coordinated the placement of each block. Though they were built for gods, the ziggurats also proclaimed the power of kings who commissioned them. Writing advanced rapidly. What began as simple accounting marks evolved into cuneiform, a script capable of representing language. Scribes recorded hymns, myths, and legal agreements. They compiled lexical lists, cataloging words and signs for teaching. Schoolrooms, sometimes called tablet houses, trained young boys from wealthy families. Lessons were tedious and repetitive. Students copied lists of signs, proverbs, and legal formulas until their hands ached. Those who mastered the script could serve as clerks, administrators, or temple record keepers. Literacy remained an elite skill, but its impact radiated widely. Written contracts reduced disputes. Recorded decrees standardized practices. Literature preserved stories that might otherwise have been forgotten. Trade networks expanded. The rivers provided highways, and the desert paths linked distant peoples. Merchants traveled north to Anatolia for wood and metals, and east to the mountains for precious stones. Lapis lazuli from faraway mines in Badakhshan, obsidian from volcanic regions, and copper from Oman arrived in the temples and workshops of Sumer. In exchange, Sumerians exported wool, textiles, and grain. Markets buzzed with activity as buyers and sellers haggled. Value was measured using pieces of silver weighed on scales. Merchants relied on scribes to document their agreements. Trade enriched the cities and created connections that carried ideas as well as goods. Kings emerged as guardians of order. Early rulers were selected for their ability to defend the city and lead workers. Over time, kingship became hereditary. Dynasties claimed divine favor, presenting themselves as chosen by the gods. They issued proclamations and reforms. One ruler of Lagash, Uru-Inimgina, enacted laws to protect the weak from exploitation. He canceled debts and freed those enslaved unjustly. Kings built palaces beside temples, decorated with carved stone reliefs. They led armies in conflicts over water rights and boundary stones. war was a constant threat. City-states fought for control of fertile land and canals. Victors celebrated by dedicating spoils to their patron gods. Law codes appeared. The oldest known, from the city of Ur, listed fines for injuries and theft. Later codes, like that of Hammurabi, centuries afterward, would systematize penalties and delineate social classes. Early laws recognized differences between nobles, free citizens, and slaves. They addressed issues of marriage, property, and commerce. Written law was intended to ensure fairness, though in practice it protected the interests of elites. Justice was administered by elders and priests who consulted statutes. Documentation allowed cases to be reviewed and rulings to be consistent. Law became another instrument by which urban society maintained harmony and hierarchy. Everyday life in the cities combined toil with tradition. People woke early to tend to animals, prepare meals, or check the state of irrigation channels. Craftsmen worked long hours shaping clay, weaving cloth, or smelting metal. The marketplace was a social hub where news circulated. Families gathered in courtyards at night to share food and stories. Children played with clay figurines and learned trades from parents. Women participated in economic activities, weaving, brewing, and sometimes trading in the market. Though men held official authority, women managed households and owned property. They could be priestesses or scribes, though less commonly than men. Life was structured yet dynamic, full of small joys and frustrations. Education extended beyond scribal schools. Parents taught children practical skills. Boys learned to handle plows and nets. Girls learned to spin and bake. Oral tradition remained strong. Storytellers recited epics about ancient kings and gods. They recounted tales of heroes who sought immortality and of divine beings who bestowed or withheld favor. These stories, performed with gestures and intonations, instructed listeners about courage, loyalty, and the consequences of hubris. The written versions preserved core elements, but oral retellings allowed embellishment and adaptation. This interplay between text and voice kept cultural memory alive. Water management remained central. Each year, after the rivers flooded, workers repaired canals and dikes. They removed silt, reinforced embankments, and extended channels to reach new fields. These tasks were communal obligations. Leaders assigned labor according to household size. Failure to participate could result in fines. In times of drought, tensions rose as canals dried and crops withered. Conflict sometimes erupted between cities, with armies seizing control of headwaters. Such disputes could last years. At other times, cities cooperated, sharing workers and resources to build larger projects. Water shaped politics as much as geography. Environmental pressures challenged the cities. Intensive irrigation led to the buildup of salt in the soil. Yields declined, especially in the southern fields. Farmers rotated crops and let fields lie fallow to recover. Still, some land became sterile. Communities adapted by moving to new areas or developing new techniques. Famine occurred when floods were too high or too low. The precarious balance of nature underscored the fragility of human endeavor. Disaster stories arose to explain these hardships. Flood myths spoke of divine punishment for arrogance. These narratives encouraged humility and reverence.
Layer upon layer of occupation left physical traces. When houses decayed or burned, people leveled the remains and built anew on top. Over centuries, cities rose into mounds. Archaeologists call them tells. Each layer held remnants of a different era: broken pots, burnt seeds, clay tablets, and collapsed walls. These strata represented not only physical changes, but also shifts in power, culture, and climate. People living in later periods could feel the weight of previous generations beneath their feet. Storytellers spoke of a time when kings were closer to gods, when floods cleansed the land, and when heroes walked the earth. These layered stories connected the past to the present. Listeners nodded in the glow of lamps.
Artisans in the cities developed remarkable skills. Stone carvers shaped delicate statues from imported diorite and local gypsum. Metalworkers melted copper and cast it into tools, weapons, and ornaments. Goldsmiths hammered thin sheets of gold to decorate temple doors or create earrings. Shell inlays glittered on wooden furniture. In workshops near the temples, craftsmen worked under the supervision of priests. Their production was both practical and symbolic: tools for harvest, weapons for defense, and ceremonial objects for worship. Apprentices learned by watching masters. They repeated simple tasks, gradually progressing to more complex work. Every completed object carried traces of many hands and years of experience. These crafts became a source of pride and identity for the cities. Politics among the city-states were complex. Alliances formed and dissolved. Some cities asserted dominance, forcing others to pay tribute. Others sought peace through diplomacy and marriage between ruling families. Councils of elders sometimes mediated disputes. At times, a single leader rose to unify several cities, only to see the alliance crumble after his death. Legends told of a ruler who ruled the entire land, but in reality, unity was fleeting. Persistent rivalry kept cities vigilant. Walls were repaired constantly. Armies trained regularly. Yet intercity festivals and trade created bonds as well as rivalries. Traveling musicians shared songs from distant courts. Merchants brought news of other cities' fortunes. Through conflict and cooperation, the city-states shaped a dynamic political landscape. In this landscape of mud brick walls and towering temples, the course of history was shaped. The citizens of Uruk, Ur, and Lagash crafted institutions, laws, and beliefs that would echo through time. Their efforts to organize labor, codify behavior, and appease the gods created a model for collective life. Yet the city-states were not isolated forever. Beyond the rivers, new powers observed their prosperity and learned from their systems. Ambitious leaders dreamed of uniting the fertile plain under a single ruler. The innovations of the Sumerian cities laid the foundation upon which empires would soon rise. Their legacy would endure, shaping dreams of kings and the expectations of their subjects still. North of the Sumerian cities, along the central stretch of the Twin Rivers, another community had been growing. Its people spoke a Semitic language and lived in settlements that shared many practices with their southern neighbors but maintained a distinct identity. Their main center was known as Akkad. Its exact location remains uncertain, but it likely lay near present-day Baghdad. For generations, the northern city-states coexisted with those of Sumer, occasionally trading and sometimes clashing. Yet in the 24th century BC, a remarkable figure emerged from this northern region who would transform the political landscape. The man was Sargon, whose name means the legitimate king. Legends cloud his origins. One story tells that his mother set him adrift in a basket on the river, where he was rescued and raised by humble folk. As a young man, he served as cupbearer to the king of Kish, a city north of Nippur. In this role, he observed court politics and military affairs. Around 2334 BC, Sargon seized power in Kish. He then turned his attention southward. Instead of ruling a single city, he envisioned something larger, a unified realm binding the many city-states of Mesopotamia under one authority. To realize his vision, Sargon embarked on military campaigns. He confronted Lugal-Zaggisi, ruler of Umma, who had recently conquered several Sumerian cities and proclaimed himself king of the land. In a series of decisive battles, Sargon defeated his rival. Tradition claims that he washed his weapons in the sea, suggesting his armies reached the Persian Gulf. Victorious, he marched north and west, subduing cities and imposing his authority. His conquests extended beyond the river valleys to regions of Syria and Anatolia. The speed and extent of his victories surprised contemporaries. It was the first time in recorded history that a single ruler managed to control such a vast and diverse territory. Sargon implemented administrative strategies to maintain this new empire. Rather than allowing conquered cities to retain local rulers who merely paid tribute, he appointed his own officials, many of them from his family, as governors. These officials collected taxes, maintained order, and reported directly to the capital. Sargon established his language as the lingua franca for administration. He standardized weights and measures. To secure loyalty, he created a standing army. An inscription boasts that 5,400 soldiers ate bread daily before him. This professional force, loyal to the ruler rather than to a particular city, could be deployed wherever rebellion threatened. Military might underpin his authority, but administration and ideology made the empire durable. The economic foundation of Sargon's empire rested on agricultural surplus and control of trade routes. Conquered lands contributed grain, livestock, and textiles as taxes. The palace managed large estates, employing thousands of workers. Trade flourished as security improved and roads were maintained. Akkadian merchants traveled to the Levant for cedar wood and to the Iranian plateau for metals and precious stones. They exchanged woolen garments and grain from the fertile plain for tin. The empire's wealth allowed Sargon to patronize monumental building projects. He fortified cities, built new temples, and restored old ones. These projects proclaimed the reach of his power and provided employment for his subjects. For common people, life under the empire was a mix of continuity and change. Farmers continued to plant and harvest as before, though they now sent a portion of their produce to distant centers. Craftsmen continued to weave, and potters continued to turn wheels. Temples retained their religious significance, but the administrative oversight now included imperial officials. In some regions, the new order brought stability. In others, taxes and corvée labor caused resentment. Rebellions flared periodically, especially during times of famine or disease. Sargon responded swiftly, punishing rebels to deter further unrest. His inscriptions emphasize his victories and the gods' favor, presenting him as a divinely chosen ruler, bringing order to a chaotic world. Sargon ruled for decades. His long reign allowed institutions to take root. When he died, power passed to his sons, first Rimush and then Manishtushu. Both faced revolts and met violent ends, suggesting that the empire's foundation was not yet secure. The grandsons of Sargon continued the dynasty. The most illustrious among them was Naram-Sin, who ruled for about 37 years. He campaigned far and wide, battling mountain tribes in the Zagros and pushing west toward the Mediterranean. His greatest military triumph came in crushing a coalition of rebellious cities. In the aftermath, Naram-Sin took an unprecedented step. He proclaimed himself divine. Naram-Sin's self-deification marked a new stage in Mesopotamian royal ideology. Kings had long claimed divine favor, but they presented themselves as servants of the gods. Naram-Sin had his name written with the same cuneiform determinative used for deities. He wore the horned crown, a symbol reserved for gods. On his famous victory stele, he appears larger than his soldiers, striding up a mountainside while foes shrink before him. This art communicates his superhuman status. His claim to divinity may have been an attempt to unify his diverse subjects under a cult that transcended local deities. It also reflected the extraordinary reach of the empire at its height. Despite these displays of power, cracks were appearing. Administering vast territories stretched the capacity of communication and transportation. Governors, often royal family members, gained local power bases. Their loyalty could waver. To the east, a people known as the Gutians raided from the Zagros Mountains. They disrupted trade and challenged imperial authority. Economically, the empire faced challenges. Intensive agriculture and salinization weakened some fields. Maintaining a large standing army and funding building projects strained the treasury. Local resentment continued to simmer. Under Naram-Sin's successor, Sharkali-Shari, rebellions multiplied. The Gutians and other groups seized control of northern regions. The once mighty Akkadian Empire began to disintegrate. Later traditions remembered the collapse of the empire as divine punishment for Naram-Sin's hubris. Stories tell that he offended the gods by destroying Nippur, or by striking a temple. In myth, the gods sent the Gudians as punishment. Modern scholars see more mundane causes: the logistical difficulty of controlling distant territories, ecological stress on farmlands, and the heavy burdens of taxation and conscription. Whatever the causes, the empire's end was sudden. Cities declared independence, and foreign invaders destroyed administrative centers. The dream of unified rule returned to fragmentation. The Gudians occupied northern Mesopotamia for decades. Though they did not establish a sophisticated state, their rule marked a dark period in Sumerian memories. After the fall of the Akkadian dynasty, a cultural renaissance arose in the south. Local leaders reasserted control. One such ruler, Gudea of Lagash, built temples and promoted learning. Sculptures from his reign show him in humble poses, hands clasped in prayer. These statues highlight piety rather than military glory. They reflect a shift toward rebuilding and worship rather than conquest. Meanwhile, the north remained unstable. The Gutians, described as a wild mountain people, raided but did not invest in infrastructure. They were eventually driven out by a coalition of city-states led by rulers who sought to restore order. Among these leaders emerged Ur-Nammu of Ur. Ur-Nammu founded a new dynasty around 2112 BC, but his reign belongs to the next chapter of this story. He issued a law code and constructed monumental buildings. Though he is not part of the Akkadian dynasty, his achievements were built upon lessons learned during imperial rule. The concept of centralized authority, the use of professional armies, and the integration of diverse peoples into a single administrative system would continue to influence Mesopotamian politics. The memory of Sargon's empire lingered as both inspiration and warning. Kings in later periods invoked his name to legitimize their own ambitions and to associate themselves with the founder of the first great empire. The Akkadian Empire also left a linguistic legacy. The Akkadian language, previously confined to the north, spread across the region. Scribes recorded myths, letters, and administrative texts in this Semitic tongue using cuneiform. Over centuries, Akkadian replaced Sumerian as the dominant spoken language in Mesopotamia. Later dynasties would adopt Akkadian as their language of administration. Even as political control shifted, the linguistic influence endured. This development illustrates how imperial policies can outlast the regimes that initiated them. Through language, the empire persisted in the minds and speech of its descendants. Art and literature from the Akkadian period reveal both continuity with and departure from Sumerian traditions. Reliefs depict kings hunting lions and trampling foes, emphasizing power and control. Inscriptions recount royal achievements in expansive prose. Epic tales, such as those about the historical king Gilgamesh, were refined and copied in Akkadian. These stories explored themes of friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning. Poetry and music flourished in courts and temples. The empire's grandeur gave rise to artistic expressions that celebrated human ambition and divine favor. Some works survive on clay tablets. their wedge-shaped marks preserving voices from millennia ago. Life for ordinary people under the Akkadian Empire varied by region. In some areas, new trade opportunities arose. Markets welcomed foreign merchants, bringing unfamiliar goods and tales. Farmers found security under imperial garrisons. In other areas, taxation intensified and conscription siphoned labor. Families might lose sons to distant campaigns or to corvée labor-building royal projects. Religious practices continued, but the focus shifted from local shrines to imperial cults. Festivals celebrated not only city gods, but also the divine king. While the empire sought to unify people, local identities remained resilient. People still identified with their city, their deity, and their clan, even as they participated in a larger political framework.
The end of the Akkadian Empire did not erase its innovations. Later, rulers adopted the use of standing armies and direct governance over provinces. The idea that a single ruler could command obedience across regions became conceivable because Sargon had demonstrated it. Writing continued to flourish under the Akkadian language. Administrative centers and infrastructure built during this period continued to be used and adapted. Even Naram Sin's controversial claim to divinity had a lasting impact. Some later kings would declare themselves gods. Others would emphasize piety to avoid accusations of hubris. The empire thus became a reference point for what to do and what to avoid. As centuries passed, memories of the Akkadian Empire merged with myth. Sargon became a legendary hero in stories told by scribes. Naram Sin's fall was recounted as a cautionary tale. These narratives taught moral lessons: the dangers of arrogance, the impermanence of power, and the role of divine will in human affairs. Archaeological discoveries millennia later, such as royal inscriptions and city ruins, would reveal the historical foundation beneath the legends. For people in later periods, the empire was both historical precedent and mythic memory. Its tale was told in hushed tones at night, a reminder that greatness could be achieved and lost. The imperial administration introduced new forms of record-keeping. Complex archives stored thousands of these documents, sorted by subject and date. The bureaucracy used seals bearing unique designs to authenticate transactions. This increased reliance on written records reduced the power of oral tradition and personal memory. It also cemented the importance of scribes. Many scribes traveled with armies or followed governors to new postings. They served as a connecting tissue between the center and the provinces, ensuring that orders were transmitted and followed. Looking back, the Akkadian Empire stands as a turning point. It demonstrated that a vision larger than any single city could be realized, however briefly. It introduced administrative techniques, military organization, and cultural exchanges that would influence subsequent ages. Its collapse reminded later generations of the fragility of human creations. As the empire faded, the stage was set for the Neo-Sumerian revival and the development of other Mesopotamian powers. The story of this first empire blends ambition
with limitation, offering a quiet lesson about the ebb and flow of human endeavors today. After the Akkadian Empire collapsed, the people of southern Mesopotamia began to rebuild. The Gutian interlude left canals and temples neglected. Local leaders recalled older ways of cooperation and renewed irrigation networks. They remembered Sargon's empire, but focused on their own fields and shrines. This period became known as the Neo-Sumerian Renaissance. It was characterized by a return to Sumerian cultural forms, careful administration, and a flowering of arts. City by city, communities revived hymns, laws, and rituals that connected them to their ancestors, while adapting to new realities of leadership and environment. Their resilience inspired later generations and hope. Gudea of Lagash became one of the earliest leaders of this revival. His kingdom was modest in size, yet rich in culture. Many diorite statues show him with hands clasped in prayer, eyes wide with calm focus. Inscriptions describe dreams in which a god instructed him to rebuild a great temple. He gathered cedar from distant forests, copper from the Gulf, and lapis lazuli from mountain lands. He paid his workers fairly and performed rituals to honor the gods. His reign emphasized piety, civic duty, and artistic excellence over warfare or expansion. He promoted fairness and harmony throughout Lagash daily. Under Gudea, art and language were deliberately cultivated. Sculptors carved realistic figures that captured human expressions and divine symbols. Musicians composed hymns that blended old melodies with new verses praising their patron deity. Scribes compiled word lists and grammar guides to teach young learners the classical Sumerian tongue. They considered the preservation of language a sacred act. Libraries were organized within temple complexes, housing clay tablets containing myths, hymns, and administrative records. Gudea's cultural program aimed to revive ancient traditions while making them relevant to his time. It served as a model for later rulers and inspired future generations widely. Beyond temples, Gudea introduced practical reforms to sustain prosperity. He standardized weights and measures to ensure fairness in trade. He recorded land grants to clarify who owned fields and orchards. These documents reduced conflicts over boundaries. He organized communal work parties to dredge canals and repair embankments. Without irrigation, crops would fail. The emphasis on shared labor fostered unity among households. Markets reopened as farmers gained confidence in the stability of their city. Craftsmen could rely on consistent supplies of raw materials. These economic policies demonstrated that careful management could be as powerful as military campaigns. They ensured lasting prosperity.
While Lagash focused on cultural renewal, the city of Ur rose to political prominence. Located near the sea, Ur had long been a center of trade and worship. Its rulers traced their lineage to ancient times and honored the moon god Nana. Around 2112 BC, Ur-Nammu seized control of Ur and expelled the Gutians from neighboring territories. He united several cities under his leadership. His ascent marked the beginning of the third dynasty of Ur, a brief yet influential period.
Ur-Nammu balanced military strength with legal reform and administrative innovation. His reign inspired confidence and stability across the region widely. Ur-Nammu's law code stands as the earliest comprehensive set of regulations in history. Unlike later collections that emphasized retribution, his code often assigned monetary fines for bodily injuries. It provided protections for widows and orphans, ensuring they were not exploited by powerful neighbors. It addressed proper maintenance of irrigation channels and penalties for neglect. By putting these laws into writing, Ur-Nammu sought to demonstrate that justice came from divine authority and was implemented through royal oversight. The surviving fragments show a ruler committed to order and fairness in his realm. His legal vision influenced future lawgivers across Mesopotamia for centuries. Ur-Nammu reorganized administration throughout his realm. He divided the land into provinces, each governed by officials loyal to the crown. Inspectors traveled regularly to report on crop yields, tax collections, and labor assignments. The state managed large herds and flocks, employing many workers who received rations of grain, oil, and wool. Bureaucracy became elaborate, with offices dedicated to livestock, textiles, metalwork, and temple finances. This administrative complexity required many scribes to record transactions and correspondences. The system brought efficiency, but also placed heavy demands on households to fulfill obligations. Officials sometimes abused their power, causing resentment among the people occasionally. One of Ur-Nammu's most enduring projects was the Ziggurat of Ur. This massive terraced platform rose in 3 tiers and was reached by monumental staircases. Its foundation contained hundreds of thousands of bricks. At the top stood a shrine to the moon god Nana. Surrounding the ziggurat were courtyards, storerooms, and priests' quarters enclosed by walls. The complex served as both religious center and political symbol. Building it required skilled laborers, planners, and large quantities of materials. The structure dominated the city skyline and reminded residents of the power and devotion of their ruler. Its presence inspired awe daily everywhere. Shulgi inherited his father's throne and ruled for nearly half a century. He completed the ziggurat at Ur and began new building projects throughout the land. He reformed the calendar and standardized weights and measures to facilitate trade. He reorganized the tax system, ensuring regular collections and accountability. He established roads with way stations where travelers could rest and obtain supplies. He claimed remarkable physical feats, such as running from city to city in one day. Whether literal or symbolic, these tales emphasized his role as a unifier who connected disparate communities. His long reign provided stability and confidence widely. Education blossomed under Shulgi. Scribal schools, known as tablet houses, adopted standardized curricula. Students practiced copying proverbs, hymns, laws, and bilingual vocabularies, listing Sumerian words with Akkadian equivalents. Teachers emphasized memorization and precise stylus strokes. The revival of the Sumerian language served to link contemporary society with ancestral prestige. Shulgi sponsored literary works that praised both himself and the gods. He also encouraged love poetry, connecting the king and a goddess in symbolic marriage. These texts reinforced the sacred nature of kingship and the fertility of the land. They were copied for centuries by aspiring scribes across the land continuously. Shulgi refined the mechanisms of government. He organized governors into a strict hierarchy and rotated them between provinces. Detailed records tracked land use, herds, and workforce assignments. The state managed textile production and exported cloth in exchange for wood and metals. Shulgi created a system of messengers stationed along new roads. These runners carried instructions, reports, and trade information between cities. The improved infrastructure allowed merchants to travel safely. It also facilitated cultural exchange across distances. The network helped hold the empire together, even as local identities remained strong. Shulgi's administrative vision endured long afterward as a model for governance. Under the Neo-Sumerian kings, the economy became more diverse. Large estates produced barley and wool, while smaller family plots yielded vegetables and fruit. Fish from rivers and dates from groves supplemented diets. Artisans fashioned fine cloth, carved stone vessels, and intricate metalwork. Merchants traveled to Elam, Syria, and the Gulf, exchanging textiles and grain for metals, stones, and aromatics. The state supported trade by protecting routes and taxing profits. Temples functioned as economic hubs, collecting offerings and redistributing goods. This integration of agriculture, crafts, and commerce strengthened urban life. It linked rural producers with distant markets, encouraging mutual dependence continually. Toward the end of his reign, Shulgi proclaimed himself a god. He ordered temples built in his honor and encouraged hymns addressing him with divine attributes. Some citizens may have welcomed this innovation as a source of unity and protection. Others likely viewed it as overreach. At the same time, maintaining the centralized state became harder. Distant provinces sought autonomy. Nomadic groups from deserts and mountains migrated into the plains, disrupting trade and security. These pressures strained the system, setting the stage for decline. Shulgi's deification also raised questions about humility and the proper relationship between humans and gods therein. Shulgi's sons faced increasing challenges. Shusuen and Amarsuan worked to maintain order by campaigning against nomadic groups, building walls, and integrating outsiders. They presided over an extensive bureaucracy that demanded constant oversight. Local governors amassed wealth and influence. The central government struggled to enforce policies. Drought and over-irrigation caused crop failures and salinization. Grain shortages drove prices up. These environmental and administrative strains weakened the state. Their brother Ibisin inherited a realm already in decline, beset by revolts and external threats. He attempted to strengthen defenses and appoint trustworthy officials, but resources were scarce, and loyalty wavered throughout the kingdom. He attempted to strengthen defenses and appoint trustworthy officials, but resources were scarce, and loyalty wavered throughout the kingdom. Ibisin's reign ended with calamity. Amorite tribes infiltrated from the west, establishing their own settlements. The Sealand dynasty rose in the marshes, asserting control over the southernmost regions. To the east, Elamite forces grew stronger. In 2004 BC, Elamites captured Ur, looted temples, and carried away statues of the gods. They took Ibisin into captivity. The administrative structures crumbled. Provinces declared independence. The Neo-Sumerian state collapsed. This sudden end shocked contemporaries, who interpreted it as divine punishment and the withdrawal of divine favor. Laments were composed to mourn the fall and plead for restoration. Voices echoed through ages in remembrance. Literature from this time expresses deep sorrow. The Lament for Ur portrays the city's destruction as a cosmic tragedy. Gods depart their temples, leaving humans to suffer. People wander, haunted by memories of prosperity. The text blends history with theology, suggesting that moral failures led to ruin. Yet it also expresses hope that the gods will return and rebuild. These laments served to process grief and to reaffirm cultural identity. They remind us that even in antiquity, people used art to confront loss and to search for meaning amidst devastation. Their verses continue to resonate today, offering quiet solace still. Despite its brevity, the Neo-Sumerian period left enduring legacies. Administrative systems, scribal training, and legal concepts influenced subsequent dynasties. The ziggurat of Ur remained a sacred site for centuries, repaired by later kings. Standardized calendars and measurements persisted. The revival of Sumerian literature ensured that ancient hymns and myths were not forgotten. Kings from later periods invoked Ur-Nammu and Shulgi to legitimize their own rule. Even as spoken language shifted to Akkadian, scribes continued to learn Sumerian for scholarly purposes. The Renaissance became a touchstone for what an organized, pious state could be. Its influence spanned many centuries and beyond. After Ur's fall, Mesopotamia fragmented into competing city-states. Isin and Larsa vied for dominance. Amorite chieftains established new dynasties. Trade routes shifted, bringing fresh influences. While political unity collapsed, cultural continuities remained. Leaders repaired canals built by Neo-Sumerian kings and claimed their titles. They adopted administrative practices and retained scribal schools. They expanded their pantheons by integrating foreign gods. In this mosaic of small powers, memory of the recent Golden Age informed aspirations. The land between the rivers remained fertile ground for innovation and adaptation. New leaders learned from past successes and failures. They continued shaping history gently into futures. In the Neo-Sumerian period, ordinary people experienced the state's reach more than ever before. They labored on state fields and received rations. They delivered grain quotas and livestock counts to officials. They celebrated festivals that honored both city gods and the deified king. They used standardized measures in trade and relied on repaired canals for water. They also felt the burdens of taxes and corvée work. The relationship was multifaceted. The state provided security and infrastructure while demanding labor and allegiance. This duality shaped everyday existence. Families navigated these demands with resilience, balancing duty and personal needs each season carefully. The Neo-Sumerian Renaissance reminds us of the delicate balance between innovation and tradition. Leaders like Ur-Nammu and Shulgi revived ancient practices while implementing new administrative techniques. They built monumental architecture, codified laws, and celebrated their achievements in literature. They sought to control nature through irrigation and to control society through bureaucracy. Ultimately, environmental pressures and external forces overwhelmed their systems. Yet the legacy of their efforts endured. It continued to influence future rulers and to inspire cultural memory. Their story speaks softly of ambition, fragility, and the enduring power of human creativity, and the lessons we carry forward into time. After the Neo-Sumerian state fell, the Fertile Crescent fractured into many small kingdoms. Amorite chieftains, originally semi-nomadic tribes from the western deserts, settled in cities along the rivers. One such leader, Sumu Abum, took control of a modest settlement known as Babylon around 1894 BC. At first, Babylon was a minor city among giants like Larsa and Isin. It was strategically located on the Euphrates, allowing it to control trade routes. Over successive generations, Babylon's Amorite rulers strengthened their position. They fortified their city, cultivated alliances, and waited for the right moment to expand. Patience became their silent strategy for power. Beneath its mud brick walls, Babylon was a tapestry of different peoples and customs. Amorite rulers married into local families, blending traditions. They spoke an early form of the Semitic language that would become Akkadian while honoring Sumerian rituals in temples. As decades passed, the city's population grew. New neighborhoods sprang up along the riverbanks. Markets sold grain, wool, and pottery. Travelers from distant lands brought news and exotic wares. Babylon remained modest compared to its rivals, but its cultural diversity and strategic location gave it hidden strength. Its patience nurtured ambitions beneath the surface, waiting for stars to align perfectly. In 1792 BC, Hammurabi became the sixth king of Babylon. He inherited a small kingdom, but possessed great ambition and wisdom. Early in his reign, he focused on internal development. He strengthened city walls, improved irrigation canals, and reformed administrative offices. He cultivated alliances with neighboring rulers through diplomacy and marriage. He watched as the great powers around him waged war and weakened one another. Hammurabi's calm patience masked his strategic mind. When opportunities appeared, he acted decisively. Under his guidance, Babylon began its transformation from minor city to preeminent power. He listened, learned, and planned quietly before striking strategically. Hammurabi's military campaigns were calculated and sequential. He first turned south, conquering the cities of Uruk and Isin. By securing these regions, he gained control of fertile lands and important religious centers. He then defeated Rimsin of Larsa, who had long dominated the south. With the south unified under his rule, Hammurabi marched north. He took Eshnunna and Mari, extending his influence up the Tigris. He negotiated and then subdued the powerful city of Ashur. By the end of his campaigns, Hammurabi controlled most of Mesopotamia. The age of city-states had given way to a unified kingdom under his crown. Conquest was only part of Hammurabi's success. He knew that holding his realm required efficient administration. He appointed governors loyal to Babylon and replaced disloyal rulers. He repaired and expanded irrigation systems, ensuring that farmers could irrigate their fields reliably. He built roads and maintained canals to facilitate trade and communication. He enforced standardized weights and measures across his territories. He sent inspectors to audit governors and scribes to record taxes and corvée labor. By weaving together infrastructure, bureaucracy, and oversight, he created a cohesive state that could withstand challenges. These reforms fostered stability and prosperity throughout his lands firmly. Hammurabi is most renowned for his law code. Carved into a tall stone stele and placed in a temple, the code proclaimed justice to subjects far and wide. At the top of the stone, the king is depicted receiving authority from the sun god Shamash. Below this relief, nearly 300 laws were inscribed. They covered topics from trade and property to marriage and inheritance. The code aimed to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. It standardized punishments and procedures. For the first time, laws were publicly displayed for all to see. Its presence shaped Babylonian identity and pride. The Code of Hammurabi delineated social classes and corresponding penalties. Nobles, commoners, and slaves were treated differently under the law. If a noble injured another noble, the penalty might be in kind. If a noble injured a commoner, he paid a fine. If a commoner struck a noble, he faced harsher punishment. The code regulated wages, prices, and interest rates. It protected property rights and defined marital obligations. It addressed the responsibilities of builders and physicians. By codifying these matters, Hammurabi sought to ensure predictability and fairness, though inequality remained entrenched. The laws reflected hierarchical society clearly, but offered protection. Hammurabi presented himself as a shepherd appointed by the gods to care for his people. In the prologue to his code, he claims that the gods charged him to bring justice and destroy the wicked. The laws repeatedly mention protecting widows, orphans, and the poor. Judges who delivered unjust verdicts faced removal and fines. While the code was harsh by modern standards, it represented an attempt to provide consistent rules. In a world where personal power often determined outcomes, a written standard offered some predictability. The idea that law could constrain authority was revolutionary. Its influence echoed widely and persistently. Babylon itself became a thriving metropolis. The city's layout included residential quarters, temples, markets, and administrative buildings. Mud brick houses lined winding alleys, while larger homes had courtyards and multiple rooms. The city was encircled by walls and a moat. At its center, a temple complex dedicated to Marduk, later the chief god, dominated the skyline. The ziggurat Etemenanki, though built later, was foreshadowed by earlier towers. Canals crisscrossed the city, bringing water and allowing boats to dock near markets. The hum of daily life filled the air with conversations, prayers, and the sound of craftsmen at work, babbling with stories. Economically, Babylon thrived under Hammurabi. The Euphrates served as a highway for goods and ideas. Merchants transported grain, dates, and textiles downstream, returning with timber, metals, and precious stones. Babylon's workshops produced finely woven cloth, pottery, and tools. The state regulated prices and wages to prevent profiteering. Markets were supervised by officials to ensure honest measures. Taxes were collected in kind or silver. Foreign traders were welcomed but expected to obey local laws. The city's prosperity attracted people from across the region. This diversity enriched cultural life and expanded economic opportunity. Business thrived in bustling bazaars every day, unabated continuously. Society in Babylon was stratified. At the top were nobles and officials, including priests and high administrators. Below them were free commoners such as merchants, farmers, and artisans. They owned property and could bring cases to court. At the bottom were enslaved persons, who were often prisoners of war or people who had fallen into debt. The law code recognized these distinctions, specifying different penalties for similar acts depending on status. Nevertheless, enslaved people could own some property, conduct business, and even purchase freedom. Social mobility was limited, but not impossible. Communities depended on cooperation for survival and growth together. Religion permeated Babylonian life. Each city had its patron deity. Babylon's chief god became Marduk. The great temple complex housed his statue, cared for by priests who performed daily rituals. Offerings of food and incense were made to nourish the god. Festivals punctuated the calendar. During the New Year celebration, priests paraded Marduk's statue through the city streets. Rituals reaffirmed cosmic order and royal legitimacy. People prayed to personal household gods for protection and prosperity. Oracles and divination were consulted for guidance. Religious life was both communal and individual, intertwining with politics and economy. Belief shaped their worldviews and actions. Women in Babylonian society occupied varied roles. Some were priestesses, serving goddesses and managing temple assets. Others ran households and participated in family businesses. Marriage contracts were detailed, stipulating dowries and obligations. Women could own property and operate shops. They appeared as witnesses in court cases. Although men generally held official power, women could wield influence through familial and economic connections. Queen mothers sometimes advised kings, Female scribes existed, but were rare. The law code addressed women's rights and responsibilities, attempting to protect them while reinforcing patriarchal norms. Family structures provided stability in a changing world and social continuity always. Literature and scholarship flourished under Babylonian rule. The Epic of Gilgamesh, earlier in origin, was copied and adapted in Akkadian. Myths, hymns, and incantations were recorded on clay tablets. Scribes compiled lexical lists, medical texts, and mathematical tables. They preserved knowledge from previous eras while creating new works. Education remained the domain of an elite minority, primarily men from wealthy families. Students spent years mastering the complex cuneiform script. Libraries were organized in temples and palaces. Writing gave permanence to ideas, laws, and memories, allowing future generations to study and adapt them. Scholars debated celestial movements and algebraic problems frequently. Hammurabi practiced diplomacy alongside warfare. He wrote letters to other kings, addressing them as brothers. Marriages bound Babylon to neighboring dynasties. Envoys exchanged gifts and intelligence. Treaties delineated borders and obligations. Some allies betrayed him, others remained loyal. Hammurabi used cunning to play rivals against each other. He cultivated spies and informants. His diplomatic correspondence reveals concern for fairness and respect, even when demanding tribute. Peace secured trade routes and allowed cultural exchange. Babylon participated in a network of great powers, balancing cooperation and competition. These relationships were fragile and shifting, requiring constant attention and negotiation from diplomats daily carefully. After Hammurabi's death in 1750 BC, Babylonian control slowly eroded. His son, Samsu-iluna, faced rebellions in southern cities. He fought to maintain the empire his father built. Over the next decades, successive kings lost territory to invaders and breakaway states. The Sealand dynasty emerged in the marshes. Kassite tribes from the Zagros Mountains pressed in. The economy suffered as irrigation systems were neglected and trade disrupted. Although Babylon remained important, it no longer commanded all of Mesopotamia. The age of centralized power gave way to regional diversity once more. This transition foreshadowed future shifts and the rise of newcomers soon. For ordinary people, life under Babylonian rule combined work, ritual, and family. Farmers rose early to tend fields and irrigation ditches. Artisans labored over pottery wheels and looms. Traders haggled in busy markets. Families gathered for meals, sharing bread, dates, and beer. They told stories of heroes and gods. They honored ancestors and taught children practical skills. At night, the city quieted except for the distant hum of temple chants. Despite social hierarchy, daily routine centered on survival, community, and faith. The rhythms of nature dictated much of life's tempo. People accepted change with patience and adapted calmly when needed. Babylonian scholars advanced science and mathematics. They observed the movements of stars and planets, creating detailed astronomical records. Their calculations used a sexagesimal system based on 60. They could solve quadratic equations and calculate the areas of shapes. They developed tables for multiplication and reciprocals. These tools aided in land measurement, construction, and trade. In medicine, healers compiled lists of symptoms and treatments, combining incantations with herbal remedies. While rooted in practical concerns, their observations laid groundwork for future inquiry. Curiosity about the natural world thrived alongside religious belief. Knowledge was prized and shared among temples and scribes for generations. Artisans in Babylon produced beautiful and functional objects. Potters shaped clay into jars, bowls, and lamps. Weavers created textiles of wool and flax, some dyed in vivid colors. Metalworkers cast tools, weapons, and ornaments from bronze and copper. Jewelers inlaid lapis lazuli, carnelian, and gold into amulets and seals. Cylinder seals carved with intricate scenes served both as signatures and decorative pieces. Wall paintings and carved reliefs adorned palaces and temples. These works celebrated divine myths, royal achievements, and daily life. The artistry reflected a society that valued both utility and beauty. Skills were passed down carefully from masters' generations. Babylon's bureaucracy was extensive. Scribes recorded transactions, legal proceedings, and administrative orders on clay tablets. Officials managed temple estates, royal fields, and workshops. Taxes collected in grain, livestock, and silver flowed into storerooms. These resources supported the king's projects and the priesthood. Courts adjudicated disputes based on written laws. The bureaucracy provided structure and continuity across decades. Yet it was also prone to corruption and inefficiency. Hammurabi's reforms sought to curb abuses, but human nature persisted. The legacy of Babylonian governance lived on, influencing later empires with its blend of authority and regulation. Its systems inspired successors for centuries afterward. After Hammurabi's dynasty weakened, Babylon faced invasion from unexpected quarters. In 1595, BC, Hittite forces under Mershili I swept down from Anatolia, sacked the city, and removed its treasures. This raid toppled the old Amorite line and created a power vacuum. Into this void stepped the Kassites, a people from the Zagros Mountains. Originally semi-nomadic herders, they had served as soldiers and settlers in Mesopotamia for generations. Now, one of their leaders seized control of Babylon. This marked the beginning of a remarkable dynasty that would govern for nearly 4 centuries. Their rule brought unexpected stability to the region gradually. The Kassites embraced Babylonian culture rather than imposing their own. They adopted the Akkadian language for administration and maintained the worship of Marduk and other native gods. They restored temples destroyed in the Hittite raid and continued rituals. Kassite names appear in royal inscriptions alongside Sumerian titles. They ruled from Babylon but built new palaces and settlements in the countryside. Over time, they blended with the local population through marriage and custom. This cultural assimilation helped secure their legitimacy. People accepted Kassite kings as rightful heirs to the ancient heritage of the land, and its traditions flourished under their care. The Kassite dynasty became the longest lasting in Mesopotamian history. For nearly 400 years, they ruled Babylon and its surrounding lands. Unlike short-lived empires of earlier times, their governance focused on continuity rather than expansion. They maintained peace along internal borders. They preferred diplomacy to conquest. This stability allowed agriculture to recover and trade networks to grow. Villages prospered and cities remained vibrant. While the Kassite kings did engage in warfare when necessary, they generally avoided overreach. Their long reign stands out as a period of steady administration amid a region prone to upheaval and sudden shocks for centuries. During the Kassite era, Mesopotamia was part of a network of great powers. Egypt under the New Kingdom, the Hittites in Anatolia, and the Mitanni in Syria were all contemporaries. These states referred to each other as brothers in correspondence. They exchanged letters, envoys, and gifts. Marriages connected royal families. The Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt, include correspondence between Kassite kings and pharaohs. In these tablets, Babylonian rulers complained about insufficient gold or requested more lavish gifts. They offered lapis lazuli and horses in return. Diplomatic etiquette maintained a balance of cooperation and rivalry among these ancient kingdoms very carefully. Kassite kings introduced a distinctive system of land management. They granted large estates to loyal officials, warriors, and temples. These grants were recorded on stone monuments called kuduru. The stones listed the boundaries of the land, the names of recipients, and the conditions of the gift. They included curses against anyone who would alter the agreement. Kuduru stones often bore symbols of gods to witness the contract. This practice created a landed elite with obligations to the crown. It also formalized land tenure, reducing disputes. The Kassites thus blended feudal elements with traditional administrative practices for generations ahead and stability. The Kassites contributed their own gods to the Mesopotamian pantheon. They honored deities such as Shukamuna and Shumalia, alongside Marduk and Ishtar. Yet they did not replace existing cults. Instead, they integrated their gods into the existing religious framework. Temples continued to function as economic and spiritual centers. Priests maintained daily offerings, festivals, and rituals. The Kassites rebuilt shrines damaged during earlier conflicts. They transported sacred statues back to their cities if they had been taken. Religious continuity and inclusivity strengthened their legitimacy and fostered social cohesion across linguistic and ethnic lines. Faith united diverse subjects under one dynasty peacefully. Intellectual pursuits continued during Kassite times. Scribes preserved and updated lexical lists, law codes, and literature. They compiled new medical texts that categorized symptoms and treatments. Astronomers observed planetary movements, recording eclipses, and unusual events. Their work contributed to the development of a zodiac. Scholars used mathematics to calculate areas and volumes for architecture and irrigation. Schools taught both Sumerian and Akkadian languages to maintain continuity. these intellectual endeavors were supported by temples and palaces. The Kassite period thus served as a bridge, preserving ancient knowledge while laying groundwork for later discoveries. Its scholars inspired future research through careful observation. Kassite artisans were skilled in many media. Cylinder seals from this period depict detailed scenes of gods, animals, and geometric patterns. Glass production advanced, creating colorful vessels and beads. Potters produced fine wares with simple but elegant designs. Metalworkers crafted weapons, tools, and ornaments. Carved stone kuduru bore images of divine symbols and snakes. Jewelry combined gold with semi-precious stones. Artistic styles blended local traditions with influences from neighboring cultures. These objects served religious, administrative, and personal purposes. The craftsmanship reflects a stable society with time for creativity and refinement. Artisans passed knowledge to apprentices, sustaining artistic heritage for ages. Under the Kassites, agriculture remained the basis of the economy. Farmers cultivated barley, wheat, and dates. They raised cattle, sheep, and goats. Irrigation systems were maintained and extended. Fields were allocated to temples, palaces, and private families. Surplus grain and wool were collected as taxes and redistributed as rations. Trade continued along the Euphrates and through caravan routes. Babylonian merchants traveled to the Gulf, the Iranian plateau, and Syria. They exchanged textiles and grain for metals, precious stones, and timber. The state encouraged commerce by providing safe passage and enforcing fair weights and measures. Markets thrived in cities everywhere daily. Kassite society maintained hierarchical structures. The king stood at the apex, supported by nobles, priests, and military leaders. Below them were free citizens, including merchants, artisans, and farmers. Enslaved people continued to occupy the lowest tier. The Kuduru system created a landed aristocracy with privileges and duties. Law codes from earlier periods were still referenced. Contracts recorded on clay tablets regulated loans, marriages, and property. Courts settled disputes. While social mobility was limited, individuals could rise through military service or royal favor. Community and clan identities remained important, shaping local loyalties within the wider kingdom and daily interactions for stability. The Kassite period benefited from relative environmental stability. Rains were sufficient and major droughts were rare. The careful maintenance of canals prevented devastating floods and minimized salinization. Population levels remained steady or slowly increased. Villages dotted the plains, and towns continued to grow. The long peace allowed families to plan for the future. Food surpluses supported artisans and administrators. While occasional crop failures occurred, the centralized system could redistribute resources to mitigate famine. Health conditions were similar to earlier times, with diseases treated through herbs and incantations. Stability allowed society to focus on cultural pursuits and shared festivities among all. Despite internal peace, external threats loomed. To the north, Assyria, once a trade city, was becoming a militaristic state. Assyrian kings expanded their territory and sometimes clashed with Kassite border garrisons. To the east, Elam grew strong. Its rulers coveted Babylon's wealth and occasionally raided. In the west, turmoil among Hittites and Egyptians disrupted trade. The Kassite kings managed these threats through diplomacy and defensive campaigns. They negotiated treaties and exchanged hostages. They fortified strategic towns. However, they avoided large-scale wars that could drain resources. Their careful balancing act maintained the stability they valued for many decades, despite constant pressure. Around 1200 BC, the Near East experienced widespread upheaval. Drought, famine, and migrations disrupted many kingdoms. The Hittite Empire fell, and Egyptian influence waned. Trade networks collapsed. The Kassite kingdom initially weathered this storm better than some. Their focus on agriculture and local stability provided resilience. Yet pressure from Elam and Assyria increased. The Elamites mounted devastating raids, carrying off treasures and taking statues of gods. The economy suffered. Villages were abandoned. The delicate balance of power broke down. By the 12th century BC, the Kassite dynasty was faltering. Leadership weakened internally, and regional loyalties shifted toward new powers emerging. Elam delivered the final blow. Around 1155 BC, King Shutruk-Nahunta led an army into Babylonian territory. He sacked major cities, captured the royal family, and seized sacred objects, including the stele of Naram-Sin. Kassite rule collapsed. Local leaders declared independence or submitted to foreign overlords. A dynasty from Yisin briefly restored Babylonian autonomy, but could not restore the old order. Assyria continued to grow stronger. Kassite influence faded. Their long stability ended not in glorious battle, but in attrition under combined internal weakness and external attack. Their era closed quietly, leaving memories of peace and resilience to future peoples enduring. Despite their decline, the Kassites left a lasting legacy. They preserved the cultural heritage of Babylon and maintained stability for generations. Their kuduru stones stand as enduring documents of land grants. Their diplomatic correspondence reflects international networks. Their artistic and intellectual contributions enriched Mesopotamian civilization. Later rulers looked back on their long reign as an example of sustainable governance. The idea that a foreign dynasty could adopt and protect local traditions influenced future conquerors. The Kassite era remains a testament to the power of adaptability and respect in securing rule. Its lessons echo softly onward through history's whispers and memory. Everyday life continued in familiar rhythms under Kassite rule. Farmers tilled fields and tended flocks. Craftsmen made pottery, cloth, and metal goods. Merchants haggled in market stalls. Families celebrated births, marriages, and festivals. Children learned skills by watching elders. People visited temples to pray, make offerings, and seek omens. Even as kings negotiated with foreign courts, ordinary households focused on seasonal cycles and family affairs. Taxes and corvée labor persisted, but state demands were predictable. The long peace allowed people to feel secure enough to invest in homes, gardens, and local communities. Life's pace remained steady and quietly fulfilling overall. Women maintained important roles in Kassite society. They oversaw household management and participated in weaving and brewing. Some served as priestesses in temples dedicated to goddesses. They could own property, testify in court, and engage in business. Royal women sometimes mediated between families or kingdoms through marriage alliances. Texts mention women receiving land grants and operating taverns. While male authority predominated, women contributed significantly to economic and social life. Their labor and knowledge sustained households and communities. The relatively stable period may have allowed women to exercise agency within established structures quietly and effectively, shaping daily survival and continuity gently. Astronomy advanced during the Kassite period. Priests and scholars watched the skies from temple rooftops. They recorded the positions of planets and noted eclipses. They noticed regular patterns and cycles. These observations formed the basis for later Babylonian astronomy, including the development of zodiac signs. Calendars were refined to coordinate festivals and agricultural activities. Mathematics continued to develop, using the base 60 system. Tablets reveal problems involving multiplication, division, and geometry. Although scientific understanding was intertwined with divination, the careful observation of natural phenomena demonstrated a growing curiosity about the universe beyond everyday concerns. Scholars were patient and meticulous observers always. Kassite governance blended innovation with tradition. They continued to use cuneiform writing to record contracts, laws, and correspondence. They issued decrees concerning taxation, labor obligations, and temple administration. Governors managed provinces and reported to the king. Royal archives contain letters discussing mundane issues such as sheep deliveries and canal repairs. Justice was administered through local courts following established legal codes. While the king held ultimate authority, he relied on councils of elders and temple officials. This collaborative approach may have contributed to longevity. Governance rested on relationships and mutual obligations rather than coercion alone, ensuring social balance for many households. As the Kassite dynasty waned, new forces were gathering momentum. Assyria to the north evolved from a commercial hub into an expansionist power with a formidable army. It would soon launch campaigns that reshaped the political map. Meanwhile, Elam and other neighbors vied for influence. The Kassites had demonstrated the value of stability, cultural integration, and diplomacy. Their long tenure provided a model of governance that balanced local traditions with foreign origins. When their time ended, the memory of their steady rule remained. It set a precedent for future empires that would rise and fall in that fertile land endlessly. North of Babylon, along the upper Tigris, lay the ancient city of Ashur. For centuries it functioned as a trading hub, sending caravans to Anatolia and receiving goods from the south. Its people spoke a Semitic tongue and worshipped a chief god also named Ashur. While Kassite kings ruled the south, Assyrians maintained autonomy and commerce. Over time, ambitious rulers emerged who transformed this merchant city into a warrior state. With access to iron and horses from the highlands, they developed new weapons and tactics. Assyria began to expand, first locally, then beyond. Their destiny was unfolding patiently and steadily. The transformation accelerated in the 14th century BC. Ashur-uballit declared independence from foreign overlords and took the title of king. He extended control over nearby territories and intervened in Babylonian politics. Assyrian armies were small but disciplined, using chariots and archers effectively. The kings of this era also began correspondence with Egypt, calling themselves great kings. These moves signaled their aspiration to join the ranks of established powers. Though their realm remained modest, the foundation for future expansion was laid. The merchants of Ashur adapted quickly, supporting military campaigns with supplies and information as loyal contributors to growing ambitions dramatically. In the 13th and 12th centuries BC, rulers such as Adad-nirari IV, Shalmaneser Pharaon, and Tiglath-Pileser expanded Assyrian territory further. They conquered lands in the north and east, subduing Hurrian states and pushing into the Zagros Mountains. They founded provinces governed by appointed officials. Assyrian scribes recorded their victories on clay tablets and stone stelae. Tiglath-Pileser famously boasted of crossing the Euphrates 28 times to campaign in the west. These kings used deportation and tribute to control conquered peoples. Their successes foreshadowed the imperial system that would later dominate, laying strong administrative frameworks for later expansion and control. After a period of contraction in the 11th and early 10th centuries BC, Assyria experienced a resurgence. Aramean tribes had harried its borders and even occupied some territories. Kings like Ashur-dan II reconsolidated the core region around Ashur. They reformed the army, incorporating more infantry and cavalry. They retook lost cities and rebuilt fortifications. This restoration set the stage for a new era of expansion. The resurgence was slow and methodical, relying on careful planning rather than sudden conquest. Assyrians learned from setbacks and adjusted strategies. Their patience would soon yield extraordinary results within a generation. Strength returned gradually, steadily. The true imperial age began under Ashurnasirpal II in the 9th century BC. He moved the capital to Kalhu, later called Nimrud, and built a grand palace adorned with carved reliefs. His inscriptions describe ruthless campaigns against neighboring peoples. He boasted of flaying rebels and erecting piles of heads. His tactics instilled fear and discouraged resistance. He also reorganized the provincial system, dividing conquered lands into smaller units to prevent local power bases. Tribute from across the empire flowed to Kalhu. The king celebrated his achievements with a banquet for thousands of guests, displaying wealth and authority to everyone invited. Ashurnasirpal's son, Shalmaneser III, continued expansion. He campaigned almost every year of his long reign, pushing into Syria Anatolia, and the Zagros. He fought coalitions of Arameans and Phoenicians at the Battle of Karkar. Though the battle was inconclusive, Assyria retained momentum. Shalmaneser erected victory monuments and black obelisks depicting subdued kings bringing tribute. He built fortresses and cities along the frontiers. The constant campaigning taxed resources, but kept the army sharp. Assyria's military machine became the most formidable in the region. Yet the empire relied on strong leaders. Weaknesses would have consequences for future generations to witness and ponder. After Shalmaneser III, Assyria faced internal unrest. Court factions vied for power. Provincial governors acted like independent rulers. Aramean states seized territory. The empire shrank. In 745 BCE, a usurper named Tiglath-Pileser III seized the throne and transformed the state. He reorganized the army into a professional force with permanent units. He created smaller provinces to break up local power bases. He implemented mass deportations, relocating conquered peoples to different areas. He conquered wide swaths of Syria, Israel, and Babylonia. His reforms revitalized Assyria and set it on a path toward its greatest extent, reshaping its destiny and ambitions dramatically. Tiglath-Pileser's successor, Shalmaneser V, continued campaigns but died during a siege of Samaria. A general, Sargon II, took the throne. He claimed divine sanction and named his new capital Dur-Sharrukin, Fortress of Sargon. He completed conquests in Israel and defeated Urartu in the north. He extended control over parts of Anatolia and Elam. He reorganized the administration, continuing his predecessor's reforms. However, Sargon died in battle in 705 BC. His ambitious city was soon abandoned as the capital moved again. Still, his reign marked a further consolidation of imperial power and territorial reach, reverberating through Assyrian memory for many decades. Sargon's son Sennacherib took the throne and moved the capital to Nineveh, where he built a magnificent palace and extensive gardens. He campaigned widely, besieging cities in Judah and confronting the king of Babylon. Frustrated by repeated rebellions in Babylon and its alliances with Elam, he made a drastic decision. In 689 BC, he destroyed Babylon, razing temples and carrying off statues. This act shocked many and angered priests. Sennacherib's inscriptions boast of his triumphs and engineering achievements, including a system of canals supplying Nineveh. Yet his brutal tactics sowed resentment and spiritual unease among his own people and allies. Sennacherib was assassinated, perhaps by sons angered at his sacrilege. His son Esarhaddon ascended the throne and reversed the policy toward Babylon. He ordered the city's reconstruction, restoring temples and returning stolen idols. He sought to heal relations with priests and citizens. Esarhaddon also pursued ambitious conquests. He marched west and captured the Egyptian city of Memphis in 671 BC, briefly bringing Lower Egypt under Assyrian control. He erected victory stelae, showing foreign kings kneeling. His inscriptions emphasize piety and mercy. Yet he continued to extract tribute and enforce Assyrian dominance through garrisons and appointed governors across conquered territories steadfastly. Esarhaddon's son Ashurbanipal inherited a vast empire. Unlike earlier kings, he boasted of his literacy. He collected thousands of tablets, creating a library at Nineveh. These texts included myths, medical treatises, legal documents, and astronomical observations. The Epic of Gilgamesh was copied there. Ashurbanipal also campaigned relentlessly, defeating Elam and crushing Egyptian rebellions. His reliefs depict lion hunts and sieges with graphic detail. The empire reached its cultural and territorial zenith under his rule. Yet constant warfare strained resources. Rebellions simmered in distant provinces. The grandeur of Nineveh could not hide underlying tensions that foreshadowed future collapse and chaos ahead. Assyrian power relied on a formidable army. It combined chariots, cavalry, archers, spearmen, and engineers. Iron weapons replaced bronze, giving soldiers an advantage. Siege engines, battering rams, and towers allowed armies to breach walls. Assyrian tactics included psychological warfare. Royal inscriptions describe flaying captives, impaling rebels, and deporting entire populations. These atrocities were publicized to deter resistance. At the same time, the empire employed scribes and administrators to integrate conquered lands. Roads and relay stations enabled swift communication. The army's discipline and innovation made Assyria nearly invincible for generations. But brutality earned lasting enmity among subject peoples and neighbors everywhere. The empire's strength depended on efficient administration. Assyrians divided territories into provinces governed by appointed officials who reported directly to the king. These governors oversaw tax collection, conscription, and justice. They were rotated frequently to prevent local loyalties. Mass deportations relocated thousands of people across the empire. These resettlements broke rebellious communities and provided labor in distant regions. Deported populations were integrated into new economies, producing goods and serving in the army. While dislocation caused suffering, it also spread knowledge and skills. The administrative system knit disparate lands together under a single authority, centralizing control effectively across wide distances seamlessly. Assyrian kings projected their power through art and ideology. Palaces at Kalhu, Dur-Sharukin, and Nineveh were decorated with stone reliefs depicting campaigns, hunts, and rituals. These images presented the king as a heroic conqueror and pious servant of the gods. Inscriptions described his battles, building projects, and devotions. Sculptures of winged bulls guarded palace doorways, symbolizing protection and strength. Artists combined realism with stylization, creating a distinctive aesthetic. The state sponsored temples and festivals, reinforcing divine sanction. Ideology served to legitimize expansion and to justify harsh policies toward rebels and foreigners, shaping perception of kingship at home and abroad effectively. Despite its might, the empire contained seeds of weakness. Constant campaigning and heavy taxation strained the population. Deportations created resentful communities. Ambitious governors and generals occasionally rebelled. Succession struggles erupted when kings died. Ethnic and religious diversity required careful management. While roads and communication networks facilitated control, they also spread news of revolts. The empire's size made it difficult to respond quickly everywhere. When strong rulers died, cohesion weakened. The brutal reputation of Assyria meant few allies came to its aid. These factors combined to render the state vulnerable to coordinated enemies, seeking to topple it from all directions inevitably. In the late 7th century BC, Babylon under Nabopolassar and the Medes under Kyaxares formed an alliance. Babylon had long resented Assyrian domination. The Medes and Iranian people sought expansion. Together, they coordinated attacks. They first targeted Assyrian outposts and fortresses. Then they besieged major cities. In 614 BC, they captured and destroyed Ashur. 2 years later, they laid siege to Nineveh. After months of fighting, the walls collapsed. The invaders sacked the city, killing inhabitants and carrying away treasures. The fall of Nineveh marked the end of Assyria as an independent state and stunned the region for generations afterward. After Nineveh's fall, remnants of the Assyrian court fled west. They attempted to regroup at Haran, but the Babylonian-Median alliance pursued them. In 609 BC, Haran fell. The last Assyrian king, Ashur-uballit II, appealed to Egypt for help. An Egyptian army marched north, but it arrived too late. At the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC, Babylonian forces under Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Egyptians and remaining Assyrians. With this decisive victory, Assyria disappeared as a political entity. Its territories were divided among new powers. The age of Assyrian dominance ended forever, leaving ruins and memories for archaeologists to uncover in time steadfast. Though its empire vanished, Assyria's legacy endured. Its administrative practices influenced later empires, including the Persians. The road systems and communication networks they built were reused. Their art and architecture inspired motifs in successor states. The library at Nineveh preserved texts that would be rediscovered millennia later, providing insight into ancient literature and science. Their military innovations were studied and adapted by future armies. Their brutal reputation appeared in the writings of neighboring peoples. Assyria demonstrated both the heights and perils of imperial power. Its story offers lessons about ambition, cruelty, organization, and collapse, echoing through history as warning tales. For ordinary subjects, Assyrian rule was demanding. Farmers paid taxes in grain and livestock. Craftsmen delivered quotas of goods to the palace. Young men were conscripted into the army or labor corps. Families were sometimes deported to distant provinces. In cities, markets bustled with trade, and temples continued rituals. People prayed to their own gods and to Assyrian deities. They obeyed laws enforced by officials. Fear of punishment kept most in line. Yet some prospered by serving the state. Daily life combined coercion with opportunity. Despite hardship, communities adapted and endured through changing regimes and remained resilient over time, steadfast. The fall of Assyria cleared the way for new empires. Babylon under Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar rose to prominence, initiating a brief but brilliant revival. The Medes played their part but soon yielded to the Persians. Cyrus the Great's conquest in 539 BC would usher in a different model of empire, one that valued tolerance and local autonomy. Yet the memory of Assyrian power lingered. Later, rulers studied Assyrian methods, emulating some and rejecting others. The land between the rivers continued to evolve. The Assyrian chapter closed, but its echoes remained in the political and cultural landscape for millennia ahead, persisting. With Assyria's fall, Babylon once again emerged as a leading power in the region. Nabopolassar, a chieftain of Chaldean origin, seized the throne in 626 BC. He consolidated control over the southern cities and forged alliances with the Medes. Together, they defeated the remnants of Assyria and divided the spoils. Babylonian independence was restored after centuries of foreign domination. The new dynasty set about repairing war damage and re-establishing rituals. Under Nabopolassar, the foundations were laid for a cultural and political renaissance that would bring fame to Babylon's name once more. His reign marked new beginnings and hopeful recovery ahead. Nabopolassar secured Babylon's defenses and reformed its administration. He repaired canal systems to ensure reliable irrigation and transport. He reorganized the army and introduced new units trained in siege warfare. He encouraged artisans to return and rebuild city infrastructure. His government collected taxes to fund public works and support temples. Nabopolassar's reign was largely focused on stabilizing his realm. He appointed loyal governors and kept watch over possible rivals. His efforts created a secure base from which his successor could expand. When Nabopolassar died, he left behind a functioning state and a respected royal house, ready for greatness to bloom. Upon Nabopolassar's death in 605 BC, his son Nebuchadnezzar II took the throne. As crown prince, he had already led successful campaigns against Egyptian forces at Carchemish. Once king, he secured the western territories and subdued rebellious cities. He imposed Babylonian control over Syria and Palestine. He captured Jerusalem in 597 BC and again in 587 BC, deporting many inhabitants and destroying the temple. These actions aimed to secure trade routes and prevent uprisings. Nebuchadnezzar's military successes allowed him to focus on monumental building projects at home. His reign would define the Neo-Babylonian era, shaping history profoundly for generations ahead. Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns against Judah are well documented. After initial submission, Judah rebelled, trusting in alliances with Egypt. The Babylonian army besieged Jerusalem in 587 BC. After months, the walls were breached. Soldiers entered the city, seized the king, and burned the temple. Many inhabitants were taken to Babylon. The destruction shocked the region and had enduring religious significance. Later traditions interpreted the event as divine judgment. For Babylon, the conquest secured a strategic corridor and suppressed a stubborn vassal. The deported population contributed to Babylon's diversity. Life in exile inspired profound reflections and texts, shaping faith and memory for centuries. Nebuchadnezzar devoted immense resources to rebuilding Babylon. He reinforced the city's walls, making them so thick that 2 chariots could pass atop them. He installed bronze gates and dug a moat. He restored and expanded temples, notably the Etemenanki Ziggurat, dedicated to Marduk. This tower was said to reach toward the heavens. He built a magnificent processional way adorned with glazed bricks depicting lions and dragons. At its entrance stood the Ishtar Gate, covered in blue tiles and reliefs of bulls and dragons. These constructions proclaimed the city's grandeur and the king's piety, invoking awe in visitors and citizens alike. Greek writers later described Babylon's hanging gardens as one of the wonders of the world. They spoke of terraces filled with trees and flowers, watered by mechanical means. Scholars debate whether these gardens were in Babylon or another Mesopotamian city. No definitive archaeological evidence has been found, but ancient texts mention royal gardens and complex irrigation systems. Nebuchadnezzar did build extensive palace gardens to please his Median wife, who missed her mountainous homeland. These gardens, whether hanging or terraced, showcased engineering ingenuity. They brought greenery into the arid city and symbolized royal power over nature and creative ambition in architecture. The Neo-Babylonian state maintained a sophisticated bureaucracy. Officials managed temple estates, palace lands, and irrigation systems. Taxes were collected in grain, silver, and labor. Large estates employed thousands of workers, producing textiles, beer, and food. Merchants operated independently, trading with Arabia, the Levant, and Iran. Markets sold dates, wool, oil, and spices. The government regulated prices and weights to ensure fairness. A strong currency facilitated commerce. Although the state controlled key resources, private enterprise flourished. Economic prosperity supported monumental building projects and a thriving urban life. People enjoyed relative stability and opportunities for advancement within structured systems and oversight consistently. Religion remained central to Babylonian identity. Marduk was elevated as king of the gods. The New Year festival, known as Akitu, reenacted the creation myth and celebrated the deity's victory over chaos. During this festival, the king humbly entered the temple, was ritually slapped by the high priest, and declared that he ruled by divine favor. Other gods, such as Nabu, Ishtar, and Shamash, continued to receive worship. Temples served as economic centers and provided employment. Priests interpreted omens and performed sacrifices. Religion intertwined with politics, legitimizing the king and offering explanations for events in daily life and governance inseparably. Babylonian scholars continued to excel in astronomy and mathematics. They recorded the movements of planets and stars, predicting eclipses with increasing accuracy. They divided the ecliptic into 12 signs, laying groundwork for zodiacal astronomy. Mathematicians used a base 60 system to calculate fractions, square roots, and volumes. Astronomical diaries compiled observations spanning centuries. These texts were used to interpret omens and to plan rituals. They also advanced pure understanding of celestial cycles. Scholars and scribal schools copied and expanded earlier works. The intellectual atmosphere of Babylon fostered learning that would influence Greek and later science through preserved records and teachings enduring. Babylon's streets bustled with activity. Vendors sold bread, beer, dates, and spices. Bakers kneaded dough in clay ovens. Weaver workshops hummed with spinning and weaving. Children played with clay figurines and learned family trades. Scribes carried tablets between offices. Courtyards served as spaces for gatherings and meals. Water carriers transported jars from wells and canals. At sunset, families lit oil lamps and shared stories. Despite the grandeur of palaces and temples, most people lived modest lives. They sought security, food, and community. Babylon's cosmopolitan population created a vibrant social tapestry woven from diverse origins and shared customs across cultures harmoniously. In Neo-Babylonian society, women's roles varied. Some served as priestesses in temples dedicated to goddesses like Ishtar. Others managed households and participated in weaving, brewing, and market trade. Legal documents show women buying and selling property, making loans, and acting as witnesses. Royal women participated in politics through marriage alliances. The Queen Mother could hold significant influence at court. Marriage contracts detailed rights and responsibilities. While men dominated public office, women's economic contributions were vital. They maintained households, educated children, and preserved traditions. Their work supported the social fabric of the city quietly and persistently, ensuring continuity always for generations.